one of the things that I want to point out to you guys is the way that the system works. So, CITES is the overseeing body of regulation for basically wildlife that could be endangered, look like endangered species, or might be potentially endangered at one point or threatened. Below that, CITES gives regulatory authority to, in the case of alligators, the United States of America, which gives that authority to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is responsible for making sure that there are tags for the alligators and that there is some type of record keeping. In addition to that, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife grants import and export permission on alligators and crocodiles, both into the United States and out of the United States of those types of species. Then, underneath that, and we're just going to use Louisiana as an example because they are really a shining star in conservation work for crocodilians, because they pioneered the whole sustainable use system, really. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife gives then authority to the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. Well, they give it to the state of Louisiana, and then they give it to the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. The Louisiana state does. So every year since 1972, the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries has done aerial surveys of pretty much the whole state of Louisiana. And they do these aerial surveys in helicopters, and what they do is they fly over public and private lands and they mark nests. Now, back in the day, I think that they used to mark nests on a map, X marks the spot. Today, we're much more sophisticated and they mark nests with GPS coordinates. And what that does is that tells the biologists who work at the state how many alligator nests there are, which leads them to conclude the population density of wild alligators. So, the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries uses that data, and they combine it with everything from topography, weather and climate change. They look at maps which are zoned for each landowner's parcel of property, et cetera, and then they do what's called a non-detriment finding. And that non-detriment finding has to prove without a shadow of a doubt to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and ultimately to all of the party countries within CITES that any trade that is happening for American alligator is non-detrimental to the species, and that is very important. It's also important to note that because this was done and started so long ago, and it's been done every single year since 1972, and that doesn't matter if there was a budget deficit in the state of Louisiana or not, they did it. They somehow found the money to do it. Well, I'm going to tell you where they found the money in many cases. So Louisiana was very, very smart when they figured out that, hey, our alligator populations are going down. What are we going to do? So naturally, an alligator nest is it has, I think, around 32 eggs in a clutch is what they call it. And naturally, those eggs are extremely susceptible to predation from other species like raccoons or anything that would eat the egg. They are also highly susceptible, the nest, to flooding. So if a hurricane comes in and pushes water into the marsh, it will actually drown the eggs. And in addition to that, if the babies were, fortunate enough to actually hatch, they're tiny little things, so they're swamp bait for everything in the marsh. So as you can understand, it's not an easy thing. They're very vulnerable, and it's not easy for a natural nest to just hatch all in its entirety.